Thank you. And this session, as well as this day, will be completed by the speech given by Dr. Arūnas Streikus, historian on church in the Soviet system in different aspects. He's working at the Vilnius University Faculty of History. He is also the author of publications on 20th century. He was quoted a number of times and he is known to us very well. He will speak on the very mysterious title. He will speak about the controlled cultural relations with foreign countries. The floor is yours. Good evening to all of those who are still awake. It's very difficult to read the final speech, so I will try to finish as soon as possible without exceeding my time limits. Speaking and writing about the Soviet system, probably one of the most often used metaphors is the metaphor of an iron curtain. But speaking about the late period Soviet times, which I believe is the mid-1980s, I believe the metaphor is not suitable anymore. I believe we should look for another one. I'm afraid I can't come up with it, any appropriate metaphor that could change it. Maybe we could speak of a plastic curtain. With regards to Lithuania or any other Baltic state, since the beginning of mid-1980s, an additional condition which made gaps, so to say, into that iron curtain, this could be considered our cultural activists in the exile. Here we can speak about relations with our cultural activists in exile and about our relations with the Western world. The larger part of our cultural elite which went into exile, Lithuanian cultural elite was isolated and separated into two different worlds, which have been developing on different conditions. The artists, intellectuals in exile tried to continue the modern national cultural tradition that was nurtured in the years of independence. The new existential experiences, new cultural environment to some of them opened larger possibilities of self-realization or provided additional impetus to their creation, to their artistic works. But on the other hand, it also gave some negative consequences as well. This, first of all, included the lack of connection with their native land. It strained their creative potential. Another important aspect, speaking about the occupied Lithuanian, this was a very small-scaled audience and a very low number of consumers of culture, because only few of those artists in exile managed to reach the Western culture. Because the consumers of their works were the people living in exile. On the other hand, cultural activists were also performing the function of promoting the ideology of the regime. On the other hand, the new cultural activist generation that was born in post-war times differently from the previous generation, which were very much actively engaged in strengthening and consolidating the regime. The second, so to say, generation of cultural activists was psychologically better prepared to restore their relations with the cultural tradition. In the times of Khrushchev appeasement, the Western culture seemed to be more attractive. There was more interest as to what is happening in the Western culture, but due to lack of direct communication possibilities with this culture, due to language limitations, the people in exile could have naturally become important mediator between the Western culture. The neutralization of cultural influence, cultural and political influence of the people living in exile was among key tasks of the Soviet regime throughout the occupation period. On the other hand, the people in exile seemed as proponents of the local regime who could have supported them. After the death of Stalin, the regime was looking for greater support of from the people living in exile and looking for new methods of communicating with them. Very soon an idea was nurtured, an idea postulating that greater parts of people in exile could be used for the promotion of the regime, and it could be done through the control of cultural relations with them. The people living in exile definitely had great value on the regime and on the legitimation, increasing the legitimation of the regime in the country. And the Soviet regime also at the same time wanted to influence people living in exile and Sovietize, so to say, the cultural elite living in exile. Therefore, although they were led by different purposes, in mid-1980s, all of the sides were interested in cultural cooperation. The artists living in exile were interested in coming back to the natural environment of creation. The humanitarian intelligence in Lithuania was interested in looking for their lost cultural traditions, and the government was interested in strengthening and consolidating its situation and its regime. Having conducted the research, it can be said that in mid-1960s, the attempt to find relations with the cultural regime was well planned. The important task of the regime was not to have a dialogue between the two Lithuanian cultural branches, but rather to show the superiority of the Soviet Lithuanian culture. Therefore, the KGB controlled cultural relations with the people living in exile, in order to raise greater interest of the people in exile to the Soviets, the regime not only tried to remind of the beauty of the land, but it also tried to raise interest in the cultural heritage of the country. Meanwhile, up until the end of 1980s, the people living in exile were very selective of presenting their activities in Lithuania. The key goals of the Soviet developing cultural relations with people living in exile were the same, but there could be several changes noticed, tactical changes noticed. We can determine several phases, one of which was from 1960s to 1970s, where relative openness was declared between the regime and between the people living in exile, the artists living in exile, where the Soviet propaganda was as if a hook to the artists living in exile. Since the attempts failed in that period, and after the case with Romas Kalanta, public life was once again being the ideology of public life was once again being disseminated, and the people living in exile tried to strengthen their cultural relations, aiming to destroy the regime from the inside. The ideology of the regime was also changed with regards to the people living in exile. There were attempts to neutralize the influence of Santara Šviesa. Individual cultural representatives living in exile were more involved in establishing cultural relations between the regime and the people living in exile. The Soviet government gave priority to cooperation with those artists in exile who wanted to have better conditions to present their work in Lithuania, and who were not dissatisfied with influencing one way or another the intelligentsia living in Lithuania. The Soviets were also more interested in cooperating with those artists which also gained worldwide recognition. Here we can speak of the painter Vytautas Kazimieras Jonynas, avant-garde film initiator in Lithuania Jonas Mekas, world-famous Unitarian intelligence representatives Greimas and Gimbutienė. All of them visited Lithuania a number of times. So much about the cultural relations with the people living in exile. With regard to direct cultural communication between the Soviet regime and the people living in exile, it was contradictory with regard to its relation to the West. There were more and more translations of publications from Western culture. The relations between with the West were expanding. There were more information, more objective information in cultural, press, information related to the Western culture. On the other hand, the new conditions also determined that there was more ideological control over the processes, which controlled the dissemination of Western culture. The cinemas had showed Western films. There were more translations of the books from Western countries. However, the reading of books, Western books, in special funds containing those books was very strict, and it was set in very strict rules. Can be said that on the eve of perestroika, the control of reading foreign books was made rigorous to the maximum. On the other hand, a number of books published by authors, the names of which have not been published before, also appeared in the public. And very briefly, before I finish, I would just like to mention that with relation to audiovisual arts, music, cinema, artistic photography, discourses were among the ones that were more or less open to the Western culture field. And the largest isolation was suffered by theater and by art. Kaunas Drama Theatre, for example, gave a lot of attention to the Western drama plays. Throughout the 1970s, they had 5 contemporary plays by Western authors. Since the 1970s, the end of 1970s, the Ministry of Culture had a function of approving which drama plays should be shown on theaters and which shouldn't be. Perhaps that would conclude my speech. If you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.